"Did you see her ring?" one of the waiters whispered, not so subtly glancing toward the corner booth. "It's huge. Her fiancé's some big-shot athlete, I think." I followed their gaze and saw her, a girl who didn't seem to fit the description of someone with a flashy ring or a high-profile fiancé. She was hunched over a paperback, her hair tied in a loose ponytail, wearing an oversized sweater that had seen better days. Her coffee cup sat untouched, steam curling lazily into the air. "She doesn't look like the type," another waiter muttered. I agreed. There was a quiet confidence about her, but nothing screamed wealth or glamour. She wasn't scrolling through social media or flaunting her engagement, she was reading, completely engrossed in her book. That simple act set her apart from every other woman I'd met in my circles. Curiosity got the better of me. I lingered over my espresso, pretending to check emails while stealing glances her way. The way she softly smiled at the pages of her book made something stir in me, something I hadn't felt in years. When she got up to leave, I caught a glimpse of the ring they'd been gossiping about. It wasn't huge, but it was there, a small, sparkling token that clung to her finger like a secret. That was the first time I saw Rachel. And the first time I felt a strange, unshakable need to know more about her. The next day, I returned to the rainy day cafe, even though I never repeated spots like this. She was there again, at the same corner table. This time, she was sipping tea instead of coffee, and the book had changed, a tattered mystery novel now in her hands. I watched as she paid, carefully counting out coins like each one mattered. I stayed longer than I planned, just to hear her speak. Her soft thank you to the barista felt like it lingered in the air, and I caught myself smiling like an idiot. But then I heard it again, from a different conversation. "Yeah, her fiancé's some pro athlete. He was in here with her last week. Super charming. Handsome, too. She's lucky." Lucky? She hadn't seemed lucky. I'd seen her with him 2 days ago, completely by chance. He was surrounded by fans, beautiful women who laughed at his every word. Rachel stood behind him like an afterthought, clutching her bag, her smile tight and distant. That moment stuck with me, more than I wanted to admit. Rachel didn't seem like someone who belonged in the background. And the thought of her fading into someone else's shadow didn't sit right with me. That's when I made up my mind. I wasn't sure how or when, but I was going to get to know her. What I didn't realize was how much that decision would change my life. I'm not the kind of guy you'd expect to spend weeks lurking in a modest cafe, staring at a girl who clearly wasn't in my league, or so I thought. On paper, I'm everything most people think they want. Young, wealthy, and not bad-looking, or so I've been told. I built my fortune in tech, an app that took off faster than I ever imagined. By 30, I had a penthouse with a view of the city skyline, a garage full of cars I rarely drove, and invitations to every exclusive event in town. But what people don't realize is that wealth can be isolating. Every smile you see, every hand you shake, it all feels rehearsed. People don't see you, they see the dollar signs trailing behind you. That's probably why I ended up at the rainy day cafe in the first place. It was the kind of place where nobody cared who you were. The barista had no idea my net worth, she probably wouldn't have guessed it even if I walked in wearing a gold suit. And then there was Rachel. She was different. She didn't try to charm anyone or seek attention. She didn't play the games I'd grown so used to in my world. That authenticity hooked me. But there was a problem, a massive, diamond-encrusted problem sitting on her left hand. At first, I told myself to let it go. She was taken. Out of reach. But then I saw her with him. I didn't know his name, but I knew his type. The kind of guy who treated the world like his personal fan club. I'd seen men like him at charity galas and exclusive poker games, big personalities with even bigger egos. Rachel wasn't like them. That day in the cafe, when I overheard the waiters talking about her engagement, something clicked. Money had made my life easier in some ways, but it had never brought me happiness. Watching Rachel, I realized she didn't look happy either. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, she was engaged to someone who didn't see her the way I did. So, I made a choice. I wasn't going to flash my wealth or try to dazzle her with grand gestures. If I was going to win her over, I'd do it as me, not as the millionaire everyone else saw. What I didn't expect was how hard that would be. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Normally, I'd have an assistant schedule my meetings and handle my calendar while I dragged myself out of bed at 10 a.m. But today wasn't normal. Today, I had a mission. I needed to talk to her. At the rainy day cafe, I walked in hoping she'd be there, and she was. Same table, same tattered book, and that same distant look in her eyes. The ring on her finger caught the morning light, a sharp reminder that I had no business feeling this way. "Back for another coffee?" the barista asked as I approached the counter. "Yeah. Black." But my eyes weren't on the menu. They were on Rachel, who hadn't noticed me yet. She was so absorbed in her book that I wondered if the world could explode around her, and she'd still be flipping pages. My coffee came. I grabbed it and hesitated. The rational part of me screamed to walk away. This wasn't my world, and she wasn't mine to pursue. But then, I heard myself ask. "Mind if I sit here?" Her head shot up. Her green eyes blinked at me, confused for a moment. Then, she glanced around. The cafe was nearly empty, but I wasn't about to let that ruin my excuse. "Every other seat's either in the sun or too close to the counter," I added quickly. She smiled, small, polite, nothing more. "Sure." I took the seat across from her, my palms damp against the warm paper cup. I had faced down boardrooms full of skeptical investors, negotiated million-dollar contracts, and navigated cutthroat deals. But sitting here with Rachel felt like my biggest challenge yet. "What are you reading?" I asked. She hesitated, then held up the cover. It was a mystery novel, the kind with a smoky detective and a femme fatale. "Good choice," I said, hoping I sounded casual. "I used to read those all the time." "You did?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. Her tone carried skepticism, like I'd just told her I wrestled bears in my spare time. "Well, maybe not exactly that one. But I've read a few." To my surprise, her lips twitched into the faintest smile. "Most people I meet don't read at all." We talked for a while after that. Just small things, books, the weather, the absurdly loud blender behind the counter. She was careful with her words, like she wasn't used to talking to strangers, but I could see glimpses of who she was beneath the surface. And for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about business or money. I wasn't calculating what someone wanted from me or how I could benefit from them. I was just enjoying her company. When she got up to leave, I debated asking for her number. But then, she tucked the book under her arm and said something that surprised me. "See you tomorrow, I guess." She left, and I stayed behind, staring at the spot where she'd been. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next day, I was there before her. I wasn't even sure if she'd come, but part of me trusted that I guess was more of a certainty than she let on. When she walked in, carrying the same worn-out bag and looking slightly flushed from the cold, I felt a rush of something I couldn't quite place. Relief? Excitement? Probably both. She saw me immediately, and I caught the hesitation in her step. But then she smiled, not the polite kind from yesterday, but something softer, warmer. She came over without waiting for me to ask. "Morning," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "Morning. Tea today, or coffee?" "Tea." She set her bag down. "Coffee's for when I'm desperate." I laughed, more out of nerves than anything else. This was uncharted territory for me, someone who didn't care about my name, my connections, or the weight of my bank account. It was refreshing and terrifying all at once. We fell into easy conversation again, talking about her book and how the protagonist was getting himself into increasingly ridiculous trouble. For a moment, I thought she might even forget the engagement ring entirely. And then it happened. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her face tightening for a split second before she quickly hit ignore. "Everything okay?" I asked, pretending not to notice how her demeanor shifted. She looked at me, her smile forced now. "Yeah. Just my fiancé." The word hit like a stone dropped into water. It didn't matter that I already knew about him, hearing it directly from her stung in a way I hadn't prepared for. I must have reacted, because she tilted her head, her expression curious. "What?" "Nothing," I said quickly. "You just don't talk about him much." She shrugged, looking away. "He's busy." "I'm busy." "We're both busy." That wasn't an answer, but I didn't push. Instead, I let her change the subject, talking about work. She managed a part-time job at a local bookstore while saving up for her degree. She lit up when she talked about it, her voice full of dreams and ideas for the future. But even as she spoke, I couldn't help wondering why someone like her, passionate, intelligent, quietly strong, was stuck in the background of someone else's life. The question nagged at me all day. So later that week, when I saw them together again, I paid attention. I was leaving the cafe when I spotted them through the window. He was waiting outside, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with the look of someone who expected the world to revolve around him. Rachel stepped out, and he barely glanced up from his phone before throwing an arm around her. The contrast was glaring. He smiled for the cameras. There were always a few lingering when you were a public figure, but not once did his eyes really meet hers. She looked small beside him, her head tilted slightly down as if she knew her place. And then he did something that cemented my resolve. As they walked past a group of women, he laughed a little too loudly, his voice flirtatious, his body language open. Rachel pretended not to notice, but her hand on her bag tightened just enough to give her away. It was in that moment I realized something. Rachel wasn't staying with him because she was happy. She was staying because she thought she had to. And I was going to change that. The next time I saw her at the cafe, she seemed distracted. Her gaze lingered out the window, her fingers absent-mindedly tapping against her mug. The usual warmth in her smile was dimmed, replaced by something distant. "Long day?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I sat down across from her. She gave a small laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Something like that." For a moment, I debated whether to push. It wasn't my place to pry, at least, not yet. But then she sighed, her hand brushing against her temple, and the words came out before I could stop them. "Want to talk about it?" Her lips parted slightly, as if she was surprised by the question. "It's nothing," she said at first, but then, after a pause, she added, "just work stuff. And life. It gets heavy sometimes, you know?" I nodded, even though my life probably looked nothing like hers. But heavy was universal, and the way she said it made me want to lighten the load for her, even if just a little. "What do you do when it gets like that?" I asked. Her brow furrowed, like she hadn't really thought about it. "I read," she finally said. "Or I go for walks. Anything quiet, I guess. It helps clear my head." "Not a fan of noise?" "Not the kind that crowds out your own thoughts." She smiled, faint but real this time. The conversation moved on, but I tucked that detail away. Quiet spaces. Simple comforts. Things that wouldn't overwhelm her, but might remind her she deserved to feel seen. That weekend, I stopped by the bookstore where she worked. Not to bother her, I wasn't about to cross that line, but to look around, to see the world she'd created for herself. It was small, tucked into a corner of an old strip mall, but it had character. Every shelf looked carefully curated, the kind of place where books weren't just sold, they were cared for. I wandered for a while before I found it, a leather-bound journal with an intricate, hand-tooled design. It was understated but beautiful, something that felt like her. The next morning at the cafe, I placed the journal on the table before she arrived. When she walked in, her eyes landed on it immediately. "What's this?" she asked, sitting down cautiously. "Just a small gift," I said. "For when life feels heavy." She opened it, running her fingers over the blank pages. You didn't have to. I wanted to, I interrupted gently. For a moment, she stared at it, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up at me, and something softened in her eyes. Thank you, she said quietly. That was the first crack in the wall she'd built around herself. Rachel showed up at the cafe the next morning, the journal in her hands. I didn't expect her to bring it, let alone mention it, but there it was, peeking out of her bag as she slid into her usual spot. You've been using it? I asked, motioning toward the journal. Her cheeks flushed, a faint pink that made her look even more beautiful. A little. It's nice to have a place to put everything. That's the idea, I said, leaning back in my chair, trying to mask how much her words affected me. Our conversation started changing after that. They felt less like small talk and more like glimpses into who she really was. She told me about her childhood, growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone. How she'd moved to the city to chase bigger dreams, but ended up feeling lost. I guess I just wanted more, she admitted one day, stirring her tea. More than the same faces, the same routines. I thought moving here would change everything. And did it? She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the window. Not in the way I hoped. Her voice was quiet, almost like she didn't want to admit it. I didn't press further, but I couldn't help wondering how much of that had to do with the man she was engaged to. Over the next few days, I started noticing things, subtle but telling. The way her smile faltered when she mentioned him. How her hand would instinctively brush against her engagement ring, like she was trying to remind herself why it was there. One afternoon, I caught her staring at the ring, her expression unreadable. Do you ever second-guess big decisions? She asked suddenly, catching me off guard. All the time, I said honestly. Her gaze shifted to me, her green eyes searching for something. What do you do when that happens? I thought about it for a moment. I try to figure out if I'm making the choice because it's what I really want, or because it's what I think I'm supposed to want. She didn't say anything, but the way her jaw tightened told me she was thinking about it. That night, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. It was clear Rachel was carrying more than she let on, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that her engagement was a part of it. But how could I convince her to see that she deserved more, deserved someone who saw her the way I did? The answer came unexpectedly, through her best friend, Mia. I ran into Mia at the bookstore while picking out a new mystery novel to discuss with Rachel. She recognized me instantly, probably from all the mornings I'd spent sitting across from Rachel at the cafe. You're the guy she's always talking to, Mia said, her tone teasing but curious. Guilty, I admitted, smiling. She says you're nice, Mia added, narrowing her eyes slightly. But, just so you know, she's engaged. I'm aware, I said carefully. Mia studied me for a moment, then sighed. Look, I probably shouldn't say this, but, you seem like a good guy. And if you are, you should know Rachel's engagement isn't exactly what it seems. What do you mean? She doesn't talk about it much, but it's obvious she's not happy, Mia said, her voice lowering. The wedding's a month away, and she's been avoiding everything about it. Every time I bring it up, she changes the subject or says she's too busy with work. My chest tightened. Do you think she's having second thoughts? Mia hesitated, then nodded. I think she's been having second thoughts for a while. But Rachel, she's loyal to a fault. She's not the kind of person who walks away, even when she should. Her words stuck with me long after she left. Rachel was loyal, yes, but loyalty wasn't the same as love. And now, I had a timeline, 1 month. 1 month to show her what she deserved. Over the next week, my focus narrowed like never before. Every moment with Rachel felt precious, like a fleeting opportunity to carve out space in her life before time ran out. Conversations became deeper, more personal. She spoke of dreams she'd shelved for practicality, of a life she'd envisioned that seemed to slip further away with every passing year. It was in those moments I saw the cracks widen. The engagement ring she wore didn't fit the narrative of someone truly in love. She rarely mentioned her fiancé, and when she did, her voice lacked warmth. I pieced together the picture. Her loyalty to him wasn't born of passion but obligation, as if she'd convinced herself this was what her life was supposed to be. Each day, I worked to break down the walls she didn't even realize she'd built. Instead of pushing, I showed her the kind of attention she wasn't used to, quiet, thoughtful gestures that spoke louder than words. A new book left at her table, its pages dog-eared to a chapter one knew would resonate with her struggles. A simple note tucked inside her journal, reminding her of the strength she'd shown in chasing her dreams, even when the world tried to pull her back. Rachel's reactions told me I was on the right path. She started opening up more, sharing the little details she'd never thought anyone would care about. Her favorite spot in the city, a tiny park hidden behind rows of gray buildings. The way her mother used to braid her hair when she was a child. The fact that she sometimes worried she wasn't enough, never enough, for anyone or anything. I listened, carefully. I knew better than to make her feel like a project or a prize. She wasn't someone to be fixed, she was someone to be reminded of her worth. But time wasn't on my side. Her wedding was looming, and I couldn't shake the thought of her standing at the altar, tied to a man who didn't truly see her. One afternoon, Rachel arrived at the cafe, visibly upset. She brushed off my questions at first, but her hands trembled as she held her tea, and I could tell she was barely holding it together. Eventually, she let it slip, there had been an argument. Her fiancé had accused her of being distant, of focusing too much on her work and not enough on their relationship. He'd framed it as concern, but his words had cut deeply, leaving her questioning herself. I didn't press for details, but her vulnerability that day was a turning point. She admitted she sometimes felt invisible in her own life, as if she were playing a supporting role in someone else's story. Her words struck a chord. I realized Rachel wasn't just battling external pressures, she was fighting an internal war, struggling to reconcile the life she'd always wanted with the one she was settling for. That evening, I sat in my apartment, staring out at the city lights, and made a decision. It was no longer enough to quietly support her. If I was going to win her heart, I needed to show her a glimpse of what life could look like, what it felt like to truly be seen. The following week, I put my plan into motion. It wasn't about grand displays or overwhelming gestures. Rachel wasn't the kind of person to be impressed by extravagance. Instead, I focused on giving her moments of quiet clarity, the kind of moments that might help her see what she deserved. The first step was arranging for her to visit one of the city's hidden treasures, a small art gallery that housed an exhibit of local artists. It was the kind of place she'd mentioned loving but hadn't had the time or means to explore. Through a mutual acquaintance, I secured tickets for a private showing, slipping them into her journal with a note, "For when the world feels too loud." When she found them the next morning, she looked up at me with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "Did you do this?" she asked softly. I shrugged, keeping my tone light. "Thought you might like it." She didn't say much, but the way she held the tickets in her hands told me I'd done something right. That evening, I watched from a distance as she entered the gallery. She moved through the space slowly, her fingers brushing against the descriptions next to each piece. Her expression shifted from wonder to reflection, as if the art was speaking to parts of her she hadn't visited in years. It wasn't until later that I found out she'd taken her journal with her, scribbling notes and sketches inspired by the pieces she'd seen. The next step was even more subtle. I'd overheard her mention how much she missed the quiet of the countryside, where she'd grown up. So, I reached out to a friend who owned a small cabin on the outskirts of the city and arranged for her to spend a day there, anonymously, of course. The invitation came through the bookstore where she worked, delivered as if by chance. It included a map and a simple note, "A day of stillness, just for you." When she returned the next day, there was a lightness in her step I hadn't seen before. She didn't mention the trip outright, but she thanked me in a way that made it clear she'd guessed who was behind it. Each gesture seemed to chip away at the doubts she carried, but I could tell she was still torn. The ring on her finger remained a constant reminder of the life she was tied to, and though her conversations with me grew more open, there was always a line she wouldn't cross. I didn't push her. I couldn't. Rachel had to come to the realization on her own, and I knew it wasn't enough to simply show her the possibilities. I needed to be patient, even as the countdown to her wedding ticked closer. It wasn't until her friend Mia intervened again that things began to shift. Mia had noticed the changes in Rachel, the way her demeanor softened when she spoke of the cafe or the time she spent reading the journal. "She's thinking about you more than she realizes," Mia told me one afternoon when we crossed paths again. "But she's stubborn. If you want her to see what's right in front of her, you'll need to be bold." Bold wasn't my usual approach, but Mia's words stayed with me. If I wanted Rachel to truly see me, I needed to make sure she knew my feelings, without overwhelming her. And I needed to do it soon. The wedding was now only 3 weeks away. The pressure of time weighed heavily on me as the weeks dwindled down. I knew I couldn't wait much longer. If Rachel was going to see me as more than just a kind stranger at the cafe, I had to do something to shift her perspective. But it wasn't about confessing everything at once. I needed her to understand how I felt without forcing her to confront her own doubts too soon. I decided on something simple but personal. I'd noticed that Rachel often jotted little notes in her journal, ideas she wanted to remember or reflections about her day. They were fleeting, as if she didn't expect anyone to care enough to notice. One morning, I arrived early at the cafe and left a small envelope on her usual table, tucked just beneath the edge of her journal. Inside was a handwritten letter, something I'd stayed up all night drafting. It wasn't a declaration of love, but a quiet, honest account of how much I admired her. I wrote about the way she smiled when she thought no one was looking. How her determination to chase her dreams inspired me in ways I hadn't expected. How her presence in my life had brought a clarity I hadn't felt in years. "I don't know what the future holds for either of us," I'd written at the end, "but I'm grateful to have met you, Rachel. And I hope, more than anything, that you find the happiness you deserve." When she found the letter, I pretended not to notice her reaction, though I caught the way her breath hitched as she unfolded the paper. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly as if she were committing the words to memory. For the rest of the morning, she was quieter than usual. She kept glancing at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Gratitude? Curiosity? Maybe even something deeper. But the next day, Rachel didn't come to the cafe. I told myself she was probably busy, caught up with work or errands. But when another day passed without seeing her, my worry deepened. Had I overstepped? Pushed too hard when she wasn't ready? Just as I was beginning to doubt myself, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Can we talk?" The address she sent wasn't the cafe. It was a small park on the edge of the city, one I didn't recognize. When I arrived, she was sitting on a weathered bench, beneath the sprawling branches of an oak tree. She looked different, tired, as if she hadn't slept, but there was also a resolve in her posture that hadn't been there before. She didn't say anything at first, and I let the silence linger, giving her the space to speak when she was ready. Finally, she turned to me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I read your letter," she said, her voice steady but low. "It caught me off guard." I nodded, unsure of where she was going. "For a long time I felt stuck," she continued, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Like I've been moving through life on autopilot, doing what's expected of me because it's easier than facing the truth." My chest tightened at her words, but I stayed quiet. "When I'm with you, I don't feel that way," she said softly. "I don't know what that means yet, but I needed you to know." Her confession hung in the air between us, a fragile thread connecting us in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. "Rachel," I began, my voice careful, "you deserve to live a life that feels like yours, not one that's built on someone else's expectations." Her eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw the walls begin to crumble. But the weight of her engagement still loomed over us, an unspoken reminder that our time was running out. After our conversation in the park, Rachel didn't come back to the cafe for days. The space she left behind felt heavier than it should have. I knew she was processing, and as much as I wanted to reach out, I also knew this had to be her choice. In the meantime, I kept myself busy. I poured my energy into work and tried to distract myself with plans I'd neglected for months. But no matter what I did, my mind always drifted back to her quiet resilience, the way her walls had started to crack when she admitted how she felt. A week later, I saw her again. Not at the cafe, but by chance. She was crossing the street downtown, her steps hurried and her face drawn with tension. I was about to call out to her when I noticed the man walking beside her, her fiancé. It wasn't just his presence that stopped me, it was the way they moved together. His arm was slung casually over her shoulder, but his attention was elsewhere, glued to his phone. Rachel didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did and chose to ignore it. I stepped back into the shadow of a doorway, watching as they disappeared into a restaurant. The sight of them left a bitter taste in my mouth, but it also steeled my resolve. Rachel was still bound to a life that drained her, and every day that passed brought her closer to sealing that fate. The next morning, she showed up at the cafe, her expression guarded but determined. "I've been thinking," she began before I could even greet her. "About us?" The word hung in the air, like an electric charge. "I don't know what this is, or what it could be," she continued, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "But I know how I feel when I'm around you. It's different. It's easier." I stayed silent, letting her find the words. "My whole life, I'd been afraid to disappoint people," she admitted. "I stayed in this engagement because I thought it was what I was supposed to do. Because leaving felt selfish." "It's not selfish," I said gently. "It's brave." Her eyes met mine, and I could see the conflict written across her face. "I don't even know who I am without him," she said quietly. "What if I leave and I'm just lost?" "You won't be," I said, leaning forward. "You're stronger than you realize. And if you do feel lost, you'll find your way. That's what you do." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, she gave a small nod, like she was finally letting herself believe it. But as hopeful as the moment felt, the reality of her situation loomed. Her wedding was just 2 weeks away, and I could tell she wasn't ready to make the final leap. I decided to give her a push, not with words, but with action. That evening, I called in a favor. A friend of mine, an editor at a prestigious publishing house, owed me a debt I rarely called on. I asked if there were any openings for someone with Rachel's skill set. By the next morning, the opportunity was there, a position in their acquisitions team, perfectly suited to her talents. It wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline, a chance for her to step into a future she could call her own. The following day, I handed her the information at the cafe. At first, she stared at the papers in disbelief, then looked up at me with wide eyes. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "Because I believe in you," I said simply. Her hands trembled as she held the papers, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "Just think about it." Rachel didn't say much else that day, but the look in her eyes stayed with me. It was a mix of gratitude, uncertainty, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. I left the cafe that morning knowing I'd done everything I could. Now, it was up to her. For the next few days, I stayed away from the cafe. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew Rachel needed time. Pushing her too hard would only make things worse, and I didn't want to risk ruining what little ground we'd gained. Mornings felt strange without her. I'd grown used to seeing her at that corner table, her nose buried in a book or her fingers scribbling in her journal. Now, the cafe felt like just another place, empty without her presence. It wasn't until nearly a week later that she reached out. Her message came late in the evening, a short but deliberate text, "Can we meet tomorrow?" The next morning, she was already at the cafe when I arrived. She looked different, lighter somehow, though her hands still fidgeted nervously with the edge of her cup. I sat across from her, bracing myself for whatever she had to say. "I took the job," she said quietly, not waiting for me to ask. Her words hit me like a wave, relief and pride washing over me in equal measure. "That's amazing," I said, careful to keep my tone even, not wanting to overwhelm her. she nodded, her lips curving into a small, hesitant smile. It wasn't an easy decision. I've spent so much of my life feeling like I didn't have the right to want more. She paused, her gaze dropping to her hands. But you made me realize I do. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of her words settled between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, I told him. My fiancé. My chest tightened. And? She exhaled slowly, her fingers wrapping around her cup as if for support. He didn't take it well. He said I was being irrational, that I was throwing away everything we'd built together. She hesitated, her voice dropping. But it didn't feel like we'd built anything. It felt like I'd just been along for the ride. She looked up then, her green eyes steady and unwavering. I ended it. The air seemed to shift, the world narrowing to just the two of us in that moment. Relief surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to push her, or to make it about me. I'm proud of you, I said simply. Her smile widened, soft but genuine. I don't know what happens next, she admitted. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe. It wasn't a confession of love, and it wasn't a promise. But it was enough. After Rachel ended her engagement, the energy between us shifted. She wasn't the same Rachel I had met weeks ago, burdened by invisible chains. There was a lightness in her now, a spark I hadn't seen before. But there was still a distance, a cautiousness in the way she smiled at me, like she wasn't ready to acknowledge the growing connection between us. I gave her space, knowing she needed time to adjust to her newfound freedom. She poured herself into her new job, and when we met at the cafe, she'd talk about it with a passion that made her eyes light up. Hearing her speak like that made every effort I'd made worthwhile. But as her confidence grew, so did my anxiety. I knew I couldn't keep hiding the truth about who I was, not just how I felt about her, but the part of my life I'd deliberately kept out of our conversations. I wanted her to choose me for the right reasons, not because of my wealth or what I could offer her. Still, the fear lingered. What if telling her everything changed the way she saw me? It wasn't until one quiet afternoon at the cafe, when Rachel looked up from her tea and asked, "Why do you spend so much time here?" that I realized I couldn't delay any longer. I hesitated, carefully choosing my words. It started out as a place to get away from things. To clear my head. I paused, meeting her gaze. But then I met you, and it became something more. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Rachel, there's something I need to tell you, I said, my voice steady, despite the pounding in my chest. I haven't been completely honest with you, not because I didn't trust you, but because I didn't want it to change how you saw me. She frowned, her brows knitting together in concern. What do you mean? I took a deep breath and told her everything. About my company, my wealth, and the life I had deliberately kept hidden from her. I explained why I hadn't brought it up sooner, how I'd been afraid it would overshadow everything else. When I finished, the silence between us felt like it stretched for hours. Rachel's expression was unreadable, and I braced myself for the worst. You're a millionaire, she said finally, her tone carefully neutral. I am, I admitted. She stared at her tea for a moment, then looked back at me. Why would you hide that from me? Because I didn't want you to think it was all I had to offer, I said honestly. I wanted you to see me, not the money, not the image. Just me. Her eyes softened, but there was still a hint of wariness in them. I don't care about that, she said quietly. I never have. But I wish you'd trusted me enough to tell me sooner. The weight in my chest eased slightly. I do trust you, I said. More than anyone. And if this changes anything, I'll understand. But Rachel, I want you to know how I feel. The words came easily now, like they'd been waiting to be spoken. I care about you. More than I ever thought possible. And I don't want to lose what we've built. Her gaze lingered on mine, her expression softening further. Slowly, a smile tugged at her lips. You're not going to lose me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Relief and hope surged through me as the distance between us seemed to dissolve. For the first time, it felt like the future wasn't just mine to imagine, it was ours. After my confession, things between Rachel and me changed in ways that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The walls she'd kept around herself were finally gone, replaced by a cautious openness that made every interaction with her feel more meaningful. But the reality of my wealth lingered in the air, unspoken but ever present. Rachel didn't bring it up again after that day at the cafe, but I knew her mind was turning over the implications. She wasn't the type to let things go easily, especially something that had clearly caught her off guard. For a while, we kept things simple. We met at the cafe, took long walks through the city, and spent hours talking about everything and nothing. Rachel's laughter came more freely now, and she seemed lighter, like she was finally shedding the weight she'd carried for so long. But one evening, as we sat on a park bench overlooking the skyline, she finally brought it up. "You've given me so much already," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "The job, the encouragement, the journal, and now, this." She gestured vaguely, her words wrapping around the life I'd revealed to her. "It's overwhelming." "I never wanted to overwhelm you," I said gently. "I just wanted to give you the space to see what you were capable of." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for something I couldn't quite name. "It's not the money that bothers me," she admitted. "It's what it means." "What does it mean to you?" I asked, leaning forward. She hesitated, then said, "It means I have to be sure. Sure that what we have isn't influenced by any of it. Because if I let myself fall for you, I need to know it's real." Her words hit me with a mix of gratitude and fear. Gratitude that she cared enough to wrestle with these doubts, and fear that I couldn't give her the certainty she needed. "It is real," I said. "From the moment I first saw you, it was never about anything but you. But if you need time to figure that out for yourself, I'll wait." She smiled faintly, her fingers brushing against the edge of the bench. "You're patient, you know that? For you, I have to be." The days that followed felt like a delicate dance. Rachel let me in more and more, but I could tell she was still working through her own questions. She'd been independent for so long, building a life for herself piece by piece, and I didn't want to take that away from her. Instead, I focused on showing her what a future together could look like, one built on partnership, not power. I introduced her to the people in my life who mattered, not to impress her, but to show her I wasn't as untouchable as my wealth made me seem. And Rachel, in turn, began to trust me in ways I hadn't expected. She shared stories about her childhood, her fears, and even the lingering doubts she had about stepping into a new life. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy. But it was real. As the days passed, the connection between us deepened into something I knew I couldn't walk away from. The thought of a life without Rachel, without her quiet strength, her warmth, her presence, was unbearable. I just needed her to see that we could build something lasting. Something worth fighting for. The next few weeks felt like walking a tightrope. Every day with Rachel brought us closer, but there was still an invisible line she hadn't fully crossed. She was opening up to me, trusting me in ways I knew were difficult for her, but I could feel the weight of her lingering doubts. I didn't push her. I knew better by now. Rachel wasn't someone you convinced with words or promises, she needed to come to her own conclusions, to feel her choices as much as think them through. Then, one evening, as we walked through her favorite park, she stopped suddenly and turned to me. Her expression was a mix of vulnerability and resolve. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice soft but firm. "About everything. About us." My chest tightened, anticipation and fear mingling in equal measure. "For so long, I've been afraid of making the wrong choice," she continued, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Afraid of letting people down, of losing what little security I had. That's why I stayed in that engagement for as long as I did." She looked up then, her green eyes locking onto mine. "But with you, it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels inevitable. Like I've finally found the thing I didn't know I was missing." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Her words hung in the air, delicate and profound. Rachel, I began, stepping closer, you're not just what I was missing. You're everything I didn't know I needed. Her lips curved into a faint, shaky smile, and she reached for my hand. The touch was hesitant at first, but then her fingers entwined with mine, warm and steady. It felt like the first solid step we'd taken together, a leap of faith into something neither of us could fully predict. But there was one final truth I needed to share before we could move forward. Rachel, there's something else I need to tell you, I said, my voice quiet but firm. She tilted her head, curiosity flickering across her face. What is it? I didn't just fall for you because of who you are, though that's everything to me. I also saw the life you were living, the one that was holding you back, and I knew I had to help. I hesitated, then added, I used my connections to get you that job. I wanted to give you the chance to see your potential. Her brows furrowed, and for a moment, I worried I'd said too much. But then, to my surprise, she smiled, a slow, understanding smile that made my heart ache with relief. I figured you had something to do with it, she said. But it doesn't change how I feel. If anything, it just proves how much you care. Her words lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I do care, I said, tightening my grip on her hand. More than I've ever cared about anything. Rachel's smile widened, and for the first time, I felt like we were standing on solid ground, together. Our relationship shifted into something steady after that evening in the park. There were no more unspoken doubts or invisible barriers, only the quiet certainty of two people building something real together. Rachel flourished in her new job. Every time we met, she'd tell me stories about the books she was championing, the manuscripts she believed in, and the authors she was helping to find their voices. Seeing her this way, confident, vibrant, and fully alive, reminded me why I'd fallen for her in the first place. As for me, I finally allowed myself to be fully open with her. No more holding back, no more trying to hide the parts of my life I feared would overwhelm her. She met every revelation with curiosity, understanding, and humor, things that had been missing in so many of my past relationships. One evening, we sat on the balcony of my penthouse, the city lights spread out before us like a glittering ocean. Rachel leaned against the railing, her hair catching the golden glow of the string lights I'd hung just for her. I still can't believe this is your life, she said, gesturing to the skyline. It's surreal. I stepped closer, resting a hand on the small of her back. It wasn't always this way, I said. And honestly, it didn't mean much until I met you. She tilted her head, giving me that skeptical but playful look I'd come to love. You're just saying that. I'm not, I said, my voice serious now. Rachel, I spent years building this life, thinking it would make me happy. But none of it matters if I can't share it with someone who makes it all worth it. Her expression softened, and I knew I had her full attention. A million things prevent us from building something greater, I said, my voice dropping to a murmur. Let me give them up. Her laugh broke the stillness, light and infectious. No, she said, dragging the word out in mock protest. Don't you dare go all melodramatic on me. I couldn't help but laugh with her, the tension dissolving into something warmer and more intimate. You're impossible, I said, shaking my head. And you love me for it, she shot back, her grin widening. I do, I admitted, my voice steady and certain. More than anything. We stayed there for hours, the laughter and conversation flowing as easily as the cool night breeze. For the first time in years, I felt free, untethered from expectations, wealth, or the weight of my own success. Rachel had become the anchor I didn't know I needed, and in her, I found the one thing I couldn't put a price on, love, raw and unshakable. And as we stood together, watching the city lights flicker against the dark horizon, I knew we'd already started building something greater. Together.